Hi, I'm Charles Purcell, and this is The Log. I'm going to be a white guy talking today. White guy talking to other white folks. So if and when I say we in my little discourse here, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about me and my fellow white folks. Because I have a problem with the current situation. We, whites, seem to be confusing our role in the whole current movement. Our primary role is not that of ally. Oh, we've all said it. I've certainly said it. We want to be an ally to blacks, to indigenous folks, to people of color, to women, to LGBTQ. All of us outside of those categories, we want to be allies. That's fine. That's laudable. In fact, I really like to see it these days when dozens, hundreds of white marchers are out in small towns, in suburbs, out in rural areas, all across America. And especially if your message is to your fellow white folks, and this is what I want to talk about today, we, white folks, have to fix our problem. Racism is our sin for which we have to atone. Racism is our crime for which we have to make restitution. It's not this ethereal, nebulous affliction that blacks have. Racism it's not their problem, it's our problem. And we, white folks, have to fix it. So that's what I want to see if I can make any sense with today, all right? Okay. A little analogy to start things out. Say a crime has been committed. A mugging. One guy beats up another guy, steals all of his money. Okay? Pretty simple scenario that we can all picture. Now there's a victim and there's a perpetrator. This is not an Oxford debate. This is not a case where you can say, well, there are two sides to every story. No, this is a straightforward mugging where we can all agree that there's a victim and there's a perp. For the sake of our argument, let's all agree on that. Now, what's the role of the victim in this situation? I mean, once he's gotten beat up and had all his money stolen. Well, there's been a crime committed. It's the role of the victim to prove that a crime has been committed, to tell his story, and to demand justice. Right? What else can the victim do? That's the victim's job at this point. Tell their story. This is what happened. I demand justice. What's the role of the defendant? The perpetrator is now a defendant in this mechanism that we all, again, can picture very easily. Well, he either pleads innocent or he pleads guilty. And if he pleads innocent, then he defends himself. If he pleads guilty, then he takes the punishment handed out. Or maybe works on a plea deal. We won't make it more complicated than it needs to be here. And then serve the sentence, whatever's handed down, if found guilty. And first things first, how about restitution? If the guy's caught with his victim's wallet and it's got $100 in it, well, that $100 is going back to the victim. So there's very basic restitution in that sense. So that's the role of the defendant. To either plead innocent and fight the charges, or to plead guilty and take the sentence and give the damn money back. All pretty simple, right? Now, there's one other party involved here, of course. We got the judge and the jury. What's the role of the state in all of this? Well, again, very simple. Determine truth. Determine the truth of the matter. Render a verdict. Hand out justice. Okay, there's our simple little layout there. Now, the analogy I promised. What if the crime isn't a simple mugging? What if the crime is racism? Racism is the crime. All right, who's the victim? Well, for the sake of our conversation today, let's just say black folks. Let's keep this in the Black Lives Matter scope of things. Because certainly there are lots of victims. Indigenous folks, Latinos, women, LGBTQ, lots of victims of white folks, right? Okay. For the sake of keeping our analogies from getting too convoluted here, let's just for the rest of this program say, okay, we're talking about BLM. All right, so the victim, black people are the victim. Who's the perpetrator? White folks. Again, we're talking about the crime of racism. This is the little analogy we're making. White folks are the perpetrators of racism. Now, if you're not with me so far, I don't get it. If you're going to say, well, if you go back to the original slave traders, black Africans were trading slaves. No, if you're going to go to that kind of argument, then we need to start over at another place. If that's where you want to go at this point, then you're not helpful to this exploration at all. Okay, so we got a clear victim and a clear perpetrator. So, again, what's the role of the victim? What's the role of black folks right now? Well, to accuse the perpetrator of a crime, to prove that crime, and to demand justice. I don't think there's any reasonable reading of history that doesn't make clear that that's been proven, certainly. The crime of racism has been committed in this country. You'd have to be pretty seriously deluded to convince yourself otherwise. So generally, the crime of racism has been proved. More specifically, in our recent context, crimes of police brutality have been proved. And for many of us, might take a little more convincing for some of us, but the larger issues of structural racism in housing, education, healthcare, all the things we talk about, I think that's been proved. Again, might take a little more convincing for some of us. But the role of black folks at this point is to demand justice. They've proved that they've been the victims of a massive crime. And their only role at this point is to demand justice. And that's exactly what they're doing. Good. Great. Now, what's the role of white folks? Which is what we're really talking about today. White folks are the perpetrator, the defendant in our analogous courtroom here. Are we going to plead innocent and just defend ourselves? Well, a lot of people still want to do that. I never had slaves. I'm not racist. I like everyone. I have black friends. If you want to get all defensive on that, well, I guess you still need some convincing. Or you could plead guilty and take whatever sentence is handed down. Now, I think even the best-intentioned ally would not want to put it that way. And I'm saying today, yeah, put it that way. Guilty. The white race in America is guilty. So where are you on that spectrum? Are you pleading innocent and going to defend yourself? Sure, there are racist people, but black people can be racist too, and Hispanic people can be racist. And there are some racist white people, but I'm not. And it's not systemic or structural. You going to take that position? All right, well, you need more convincing then. We'll have to work on that. Or do you recognize a white supremacist America? Recognize your own privilege that comes from that? Maybe you're there on the spectrum. We've talked in other programs, too, about the fact there are different stages of awareness when it comes to white privilege. I'm noticing a lot of folks who fess up say, yes, I am the beneficiary of white privilege. but they put it all in their past. Oh, I got in trouble as a kid with the cops, but they just gave me a warning and let me go. Or I got pulled over for something or other, but the cop was nice to me. Or I know I've had advantages in education and in job interviews. They recognize their privilege, but don't ever seem to take it to the next step. And that is that white privilege continues. It's not just how I got here, it's where I am. And it's where I'm going to be tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next year and the next decade, unless we do something about it. So even those who are kind of woke about white privilege, they don't seem to understand how it continues and moves forward. Anyway, we won't get off on that. Right now we're talking about the role of white folks in this analogous courtroom we've built. And that is, you're going to plead innocent and defend, or you're going to plead guilty and take your lumps. Now, note, the role of the defendant in our little courtroom is not to be an ally of the victim, at least not at this stage of the game. You're not the victim's ally. You're either going to defend yourself or you're going to give yourself up, but you're not going to be their ally. You're not going to go sit on their side of the courtroom and pat them on the back and say, good luck. No, that's not your role right now. That's kind of not helping. All right, we're in it. We're still in our courtroom. What's the role of the state? Now we got a judge and a jury, right? Well, to determine truth, to render a verdict, to mete out justice. And in the crime of racism, we've seen this happen. There have been landmark Supreme Court decisions like Brown v. Board, landmark legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. So we've seen this played out to some success. And now whatever's next. We've seen in the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the ensuing protests that states and cities all over the country are grappling with, and some have already passed, specific legislation about reimagining the police, about reallocating funds from police to social services, specific guidance about chokeholds and things like that. And then whatever larger legislation or court decisions we can come up with here in the next days, months, and couple of years. So like the classic civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, I think the Black Lives Matter movement of our current time will come up with some solutions. But let's get back to our little mugger example that we started with. You know, this analogy probably not quite adequate to describe our current situation. Let's try another analogy. Not just a guy, not just a victim and a mugger. I think the problem of racism in America, the crime of racism in America, is more like corporate crime. For example, almost 2 years after the terrible fire in Paradise, California, Pacific Gas and Electric pleaded guilty to 87 counts of involuntary manslaughter. No individuals were fined or jailed. PG&E itself paid a fine that was, a fraction of their quarterly earnings. And yeah, they took a hit on other efforts of restitution. They had to make things right. So yeah, and they even filed for bankruptcy. But they'll realign and they'll get through it. And their shareholders lost some money over the course of a couple of years. But then, they'll get it all back. And nobody went to jail. That's how corporate crime works. Well, I think that might be a better analogy for our little court case here. The crime of racism committed by Whites, Inc., American Whites, Inc., and we, white folks, are all the shareholders of Whites, Inc. And to further complicate this thing, who's the judge and the jury? in this case against Whites, Inc. Whites, Inc. has been accused of racism. And the judge and the jury, well, they're the CEO and the board of directors of Whites, Inc. Right? Because we, white folks, hold all the levers of power. We are the state. We are the judge and jury, as well as the defendant. This is not conducive to justice. All we're left is to count on the idea that we might do the right thing. The judge, the jury, the CEO, the board of directors, the shareholders, we just got to hope that they do the right thing. Which, again, we saw examples to go back to the original civil rights era, to go back to the 50s and 60s. There were some pretty good decisions made. Did it get us where we needed to be? Well, obviously not. But there was a moment, there was some success when the people who held power actually did the right thing. Well, can we count on that? I don't know. I'm not happy with that option. I don't want to have to rely on us doing the right thing. And this gets us back to the roles that each of us play. It's not the role of the victim to make things right. Black people didn't start this whole mess. And I'm making the case today that whites are putting way too much burden on blacks. Once they make their case, it's the role of the court to provide justice and to order restitution. And once found guilty, it's the perpetrator's role to carry out that restitution. And if all of us whites are shareholders of Whites, Inc., benefiting from all the privileges that entails, our role is to do the right thing. But you can see the obstacles in the way of that. So that's why it's just so important. It's so important that we dismantle the current structure wherein the state and Whites, Inc. are one and the same. We can't just rely on us to do the right thing. Sure, it might happen once every 50 years. We make a little progress, one step forward, two steps back. No, we got to dismantle the structure. We have to dissolve Whites, Inc. Well, how do we do that? All right, let's tweak our analogy one last time here. Let's try the model of restorative justice. Our little mugger victim analogy only took us so far. I think corporate crime is a much closer comparison. But let's put this in the realm of restorative justice. I'm going to take a couple minutes and just read to you from restorativejustice.org, and then we'll apply it to our current situation. All right, reading from restorativejustice.org. Restorative justice views crime as more than breaking the law. It also causes harm to people, relationships, and the community. So, a just response must address those harms as well as the wrongdoing. If the parties are willing, the best way to do this is to help them meet to discuss those harms and how to bring about resolution. Sometimes those meetings lead to transformational changes in their lives. Notice three big ideas. 1. Repair. Crime causes harm, and justice requires repairing that harm. 2. Encounter. The best way to determine how to do that is to have the parties decide together. And 3. Transformation. This can cause fundamental change in people, relationships, and communities. A more formal definition is this. Restorative justice is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior. It is best accomplished through cooperative processes that allow all willing stakeholders to meet. This can lead to transformation of people, relationships, and communities. The foundational principles of restorative justice have been summarized as follows. 1. Crime causes harm, and justice should focus on repairing that harm. 2. The people most affected by the crime should be able to participate in its resolution. And 3. The responsibility of the government is to maintain order, and of the community to build peace. So there's your front page from restorativejustice.org. Notice it doesn't try to both sides everything. I mean, yeah, all parties are involved in the solution, right, of course, but they don't redefine the parties. One is clearly the victim, and the other is the criminal. They don't mix up those terms. They do want to get, quote-unquote, both sides together to find greater solutions for the community, but they're not mixing up who did the dirty deed here. That's something that we fall victim to all the time when we want to have, quote-unquote, both sides to every issue. No, let's keep our definitions clear here. We have criminals and we have victims. And we're talking about the crime of racism today. So in this restorative justice model, Whites, Inc. can be found guilty of the crime of racism and then sit down with the victims and with everyone's input, find ways to move forward. Now is the time to become an ally. I started out by saying it's not the role of whites to be an ally. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's really not meeting your responsibility of confession to a crime and willingness to make restitution. Marching arm in arm and chanting the slogans is nice, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it's really not our job. Our job is to take responsibility. So if we put what I've been calling Whites, Inc. into the restorative justice model, well, then there are concrete steps. And we've already seen some of them. Again, reimagining the police. Because what are police if not the security guards of Whites, Inc.? Reallocating funds. There are just tons of solutions out there, tons of proposals. Way over my pay grade. Dismantling the prison system, a mass pardon and release of nonviolent, especially drug-related crimes. Strict policing of non-discrimination laws in housing, education, healthcare, etc. And then the big one, of course, reparations, which I am totally unqualified to talk about. All I'll say right now is I'm absolutely 100% in favor of reparations. Exactly what that looks like, I don't know, because I'm kind of a dummy about some things. But read some Ta-Nehisi Coates or read some other great thinkers out there about what reparations should look like. But while you're doing that, just remember, we have to keep this in the concrete. We have to keep this in the real world. We can't just get caught up like many have done. I've seen it. Sort of get caught up in learning. Oh, I want to learn how to be an ally. Again, nothing wrong with it. But too much satisfaction in your own enlightenment. Oh, look how enlightened I'm becoming. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's a necessary first step. But you got to get through that first step in order to get to the real meat of the matter. We got to make some concrete changes. We got to change laws. We got to dismantle structures. And it does not happen without white folks right there in the fight. None of this happens without the white folks. In our courtroom analogy, we have been found guilty. Black folks can demand justice, but they can't carry it out without us. They can't have justice without us. It's just impossible. And as beautiful as your white allyship is, it's not going to get the job done. So I'm asking us to think beyond that and to think in concrete terms. I've been using analogies today, but this is not just a little philosophical exercise. So no, this is not analogous to a simple mugging. Beat a guy up and take his money. It's more like the corporate crime, where we are the shareholders, and the CEO and the board of directors of Whites, Inc. are not only the perpetrators of the crime, but also the judge and jury in the adjudication of that crime. So, problems. Maybe that's why we're 450 years into this without a whole lot of progress. And that's why I think the idea of restorative justice is the best model here. Concrete solutions with all stakeholders involved. And by all stakeholders, not to confuse the issue that, oh, there are two sides to every story. No, there's the criminal, there's the victim. They are not equal in their moral value. One has been harmed, the other has caused the harm. No, we're not equating these two. We're only putting them together in the restorative justice model so that they can work together to have a better future for everybody. So no both sides confusion here. Bottom line. Racism is the sin that whites have committed. Racism is the virus that whites carry, and it causes the disease that needs to be eradicated. Now, those are metaphors, like our courtroom scenarios were metaphors. But racism is not a metaphor. Racism is the very real crime that whites have been found guilty of. And it infiltrates nearly every waking moment in the lives of black people. So we've got to stop putting it on them to solve the problem. And that's why I say we are not allies in their fight. We are the perpetrators of the wrongdoing that must be made right. It's our problem. It's our sin. It's our crime. It's our crime. And there is no justice until we make it right. We can do it. Come on, white folks. Are you with me on this? All right. I'm Charles Purcell.